The dust kicked up by Martha's worn boots settled slowly in the afternoon heat as she approached the sheriff's office. Through the barred window, she could see him, the man the whole town called Devil Jake Morrison. His dark hair hung in matted strands over his face, and his clothes bore the stains of weeks in that cramped cell. But Martha saw something different. Where others saw a monster, she glimpsed a broken soul drowning in darkness, desperately reaching for any fragment of light. The townspeople had been clear about their feelings. "That man's got the devil in him, Martha," old Mrs. Henderson had warned just that morning. "Killed 3 men in cold blood, they say. Ain't no saving a soul like that." But Martha had lived long enough to know that sometimes the most wounded hearts beat behind the angriest faces. She'd seen it in her late husband after the war, seen it in her own son before consumption took him. Pain had a way of twisting people into shapes they never meant to become. Before I continue with this powerful story of redemption and hope, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying these tales from the Old West. And please, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love connecting with folks from all corners of the world who share a passion for these timeless stories of human struggle and triumph. Sheriff Coleman looked up from his paperwork as Martha entered, his weathered face creasing into familiar lines of concern. "Martha, you sure about this? That man's dangerous. The judge'll be here next week and then—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew what came next. The rope, the crowd, the final judgment of a town that had already made up its mind. "I've made my decision, Sheriff," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've got the papers right here. Legal guardianship transfer, signed and witnessed. That man needs someone to believe in him, and I aim to be that someone." Jake Morrison had arrived in Tombstone Creek 3 months ago, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Nobody knew much about his past, except that he carried it heavy on his shoulders and wore it dark in his eyes. He'd taken work at the silver mine, kept to himself mostly, drinking alone at the saloon when his shift ended. The trouble started when the Garrett brothers decided they didn't like sharing their town with a stranger who wouldn't bow his head and shuffle his feet when they passed. The fight that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening. Martha had been closing up her general store when she heard the commotion from the saloon. By the time she reached the street, 3 men lay dead in the dust, and Jake Morrison stood over them with blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes. The Garrett brothers had pushed too hard, said things about Jake's family that no man should have to hear. But when the smoke cleared and the witnesses told their tales, all anyone remembered was the killing, not what led to it. "You don't understand what you're asking for." Jake's voice was rough as sandpaper when Martha first visited him in jail. "I ain't worth saving, lady. Whatever you think you see in me, you're wrong." But Martha had spent 30 years reading people's hearts, and she knew the difference between evil and pain. "I see a man who's been hurt so deep he thinks hurting others is the only way to make it stop," she told him. "I see someone who's forgotten that there's still good in this world, still people who care." Jake turned away from her then, but not before she caught the glimmer of tears he was fighting to hold back. "My family's dead," he whispered. "Apaches took them 2 years ago. My wife, my little girl. I couldn't save them. Couldn't do nothing but watch." The pieces began falling into place for Martha. The drinking, the fighting, the way he flinched whenever children laughed in the street. Jake Morrison wasn't a devil. He was a father drowning in grief, a husband lost without his anchor, a man who'd forgotten how to live after losing everything that made life worth living. "Grief ain't a sin, son," Martha said gently. "But letting it turn you into something you're not, that's when the real dying begins." Over the following weeks, Martha visited Jake every day. She brought him decent food, clean clothes, and something he'd forgotten existed: conversation that didn't end in anger or violence. She told him about her own losses: her husband who'd come back from the war a different man, her son who'd fought consumption with more courage than any soldier. She shared the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving when everything inside you wants to quit. "Why?" Jake asked one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, watching the way the afternoon lights slanted through the cell window. "Because I've been where you are," she finally said. "After my boy died, I wanted to die too. Wanted to just lay down and let the world end. But then I realized something. The people we love, they don't want us to stop living. They want us to find a way to carry their love forward, to let it make us better instead of bitter." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Jake fought against hope like a man fighting quicksand, afraid that if he let himself believe in tomorrow, today's pain would somehow dishonor yesterday's losses. But Martha was patient, persistent, and most importantly, she was present. When the nightmares came, she was there with coffee and conversation. When the anger rose like a tide, she was there with understanding instead of judgment. The town, however, was less forgiving. "You're making a mistake, Martha," Reverend Phillips warned her after Sunday service. "Some souls are too far gone for redemption. That man's got blood on his hands." "So did Moses," Martha replied calmly. "So did David. So did Paul. Seems to me the good book's full of folks who found their way back from dark places. But it was young Timothy Fletcher who really tested everyone's resolve. The boy was only 8, with freckles scattered across his nose and a gap-toothed grin that could melt the hardest heart. He'd been playing near the jail when his ball rolled too close to Jake's cell window. Instead of running away screaming like most children did, Timothy had simply asked, "Mister, can you throw my ball back?" Jake had stared at the boy for a long moment, seeing in those innocent eyes an echo of his own daughter's face. With trembling hands, he'd picked up the ball and gently rolled it back through the bars. "There you go, son." "Thank you, mister," Timothy had said with that guileless smile children possess. "My mama says you're dangerous, but you seem nice to me." That simple exchange broke something open in Jake Morrison's chest. For the first time in 2 years, he remembered what it felt like to be seen as something other than a threat, to be trusted by someone who had no reason to fear him. When Martha arrived for her daily visit, she found him weeping. Not the bitter tears of rage he'd shed before, but the cleansing tears of a man finally allowing himself to grieve properly. "I want to be better," he told her through his tears. "I want to be the kind of man my wife would be proud of, the kind of father my little girl would remember with love instead of shame." Martha reached through the bars and took his hand. "Then that's exactly what you'll become." The day of the judge's arrival dawned gray and threatening, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. The whole town had turned out for what they expected to be a quick trial and quicker execution. Judge Harrison was known for his efficiency and his intolerance for violence. But he was also known for his fairness. And when Martha stood up in that crowded courtroom and requested to speak on Jake's behalf, he listened. "Your Honor," Martha began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "I stand before you today not to excuse what this man has done, but to testify to what he can become. I've spent these past weeks getting to know Jake Morrison, not the legend the town has created, but the man himself. And I'm here to tell you that beneath all that pain and anger is a soul worth saving. The prosecutor objected, the crowd murmured, but Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. Continue, Mrs. Patterson. This man lost his family in the most horrible way imaginable, Martha continued. He's been carrying that grief like a poison in his veins, letting it turn him into something he never meant to be. But grief ain't evil, Your Honor. It's love with nowhere to go. And if we can help him find a way to channel that love into something positive, something healing, then maybe we can prevent other tragedies from happening. She turned to look at Jake, who sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I'm asking this court to release Jake Morrison into my custody. I'll take full responsibility for his actions, his rehabilitation, his integration back into society. I believe in redemption, Your Honor. I believe that no soul is too far gone to find its way back to the light. The courtroom erupted in angry voices. He's a killer, someone shouted. You can't just let him walk free. But Judge Harrison's gavel brought order back to the chaos. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, do you have anything to say for yourself? Jake stood slowly, his legs shaking with the weight of the moment. For a long time, he simply stood there, struggling to find words that could somehow bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he wanted to become. Your Honor, he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I can't undo what I've done. I can't bring back the men I killed, can't take back the fear I've brought to this town. But I can promise you this, if you give me this chance, if you let Mrs. Patterson help me find my way back to being human again, I'll spend every day of the rest of my life trying to make amends. I'll work to heal instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy. I'll try to become the man my wife and daughter would want me to be. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison studied Jake for what felt like an eternity, weighing justice against mercy, punishment against redemption. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Morrison, you stand convicted of manslaughter in the deaths of 3 men. Under normal circumstances, that would mean the gallows. But these are not normal circumstances. Mrs. Patterson's testimony, combined with the evidence of provocation and your own obvious remorse, leads me to believe that justice might be better served through rehabilitation than execution. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive, but the judge continued over their protests. I hereby sentence you to 5 years of supervised custody under the guardianship of Mrs. Martha Patterson. You will work to make restitution to this community. You will submit to regular evaluations of your progress, and you will demonstrate through your actions that Mrs. Patterson will be essential to betterment and accountability. Patterson's faith in you is justified. Should you violate the terms of this arrangement in any way, you will face the full penalty of the law. Do you accept these terms? Jake's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, I accept. As the gavel fell and the crowd began to disperse in angry murmurs, Martha felt a hand slip into hers. She looked down to see young Timothy Fletcher standing beside her, his gap-toothed grin bright as sunshine. I told you he was nice, Mrs. Patterson, the boy said simply. Sometimes grown-ups just forget how to be nice, but they can remember if someone helps them. Out of the mouths of babes, Martha thought, squeezing the child's hand gently. sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the smallest voices. The months that followed were not easy. Jake moved into the small room above Martha's general store, and together they began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a life from the ashes of tragedy. There were setbacks, nights when the nightmares came so fierce that Jake would wake screaming, days when the weight of his grief seemed too heavy to bear. But there were also small victories, moments of grace that reminded them both why they'd chosen this difficult path. Jake threw himself into honest work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his demons. He repaired fences, helped with harvests, and slowly began to earn the grudging respect of some townspeople through the simple virtue of showing up every day and doing what needed to be done. Martha watched him carefully, offering guidance when he asked for it and space when he needed to work through things on his own. The real breakthrough came 6 months after the trial, when a fire broke out at the schoolhouse during evening lessons. Jake was walking past when he heard the screams, saw the smoke pouring from the windows. Without hesitation, he ran toward the danger instead of away from it, kicking down the door and plunging into the smoke-filled building. He emerged minutes later, carrying 2 children in his arms, his clothes singed and his lungs burning from the smoke. He went back in 3 more times, each trip bringing out another child or helping teacher Miss Sarah to safety. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, Jake had saved 7 lives and suffered burns on his hands and arms that would leave permanent scars. As he sat on the ground afterward, coughing up smoke and refusing medical attention until he was sure all the children were safe, something fundamental shifted in the town's perception of him. Here was not the devil they'd imagined, but a man who would risk his own life to save others, including the children of people who had called for his execution. "Why?" Sheriff Coleman asked him later, as the doctor bandaged his burns. "Why risk your life for people who hate you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the children reunite with their terrified parents. "Because that's what my little girl would have wanted me to do," he said finally. "She always said I was her hero. Maybe it's time I started acting like one." The transformation in Jake Morrison became the talk of 3 counties. The man who had once been known as Devil Jake was now simply Jake, the man who'd saved the schoolchildren, who helped widows with their chores, who could gentle a spooked horse with just his voice and his patience. He still carried his grief, would always carry it, but he'd learned to let it make him compassionate instead of cruel. Martha watched this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who has nurtured a damaged plant back to health. She'd known from the beginning that Jake wasn't evil. He was just a man who had forgotten how to hope. All he'd needed was someone to believe in him, long enough for him to remember how to believe in himself. The final validation of Jake's redemption came 2 years after the trial, when young Timothy Fletcher went missing during a sudden spring storm. The boy had been playing near the creek when the flash flood hit, and by the time his absence was discovered, the water was running high and dangerous. The whole town turned out to search, but it was Jake who found the boy, clinging to a fallen tree branch in the middle of the raging current. Without hesitation, Jake plunged into the flood-swollen creek, fighting against the current to reach the terrified child. The rescue was harrowing. Twice, Jake nearly lost his grip on both Timothy and the branch, and once he disappeared completely under the muddy water. But he never gave up, never stopped fighting, and when he finally dragged himself and the boy to safety on the far bank, the crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers. As Jake knelt in the mud, holding the sobbing child and whispering words of comfort, Martha felt tears streaming down her own face. This was the man she'd seen in that jail cell 2 years ago. Not the devil the town had imagined, but the hero he'd always had the potential to become. Timothy's father, who had been among the loudest voices calling for Jake's execution, approached with tears in his eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I owe you a debt I can never repay." Jake looked up at him, still holding the shivering boy. "No debt," he said simply. "This is what neighbors do for each other. This is what family does." And in that moment, Martha knew that Jake Morrison had finally found his way home, not to a place, but to himself. The devil the town had feared was gone, replaced by a man who understood that redemption isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing to write a better future. As the sun set over Tombstone Creek that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Martha sat on her porch, watching Jake teach Timothy how to whittle a wooden horse. The boy's laughter rang out clear and bright in the evening air, and Jake's face wore an expression of peace that had been absent for far too long. "You did it," Martha whispered to herself, thinking of the broken man she'd first met in that jail cell. "You found your way back to the light." And in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, she could almost hear the voices of Jake's wife and daughter, finally at peace, knowing that their husband and father had remembered how to be the hero they'd always believed him to be. Sometimes, Martha reflected, the greatest victories are not won on battlefields or in courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when a soul chooses love over hate, hope over despair, redemption over revenge. The devil they'd all feared had never really existed. There had only been a man in pain, waiting for someone to see past the darkness to the light that still flickered within. And sometimes, that's all any of us really need. Someone who believes in us enough to help us believe in ourselves again.